Is this a war against actual natural herd immunity? Is it that they're trying to mask us and keep the virus from spreading fast enough so that we still need a vaccine when one can finally come along? I mean, by the way, SARS, 2 years it was gone. MERS, another coronavirus, very deadly, 2 years it was gone. These things usually disappear in 2 years. So are we forcing them to rush a vaccine just so they can get it to us before we don't need it anymore? Is there a war against herd immunity? One might think so if you remember what Tony Fauci said.
Ultimately, the showstopper will be obviously a vaccine where you can vaccinate people and you won't have it. There's going to be another issue that's going to be important, and it has to do with somewhat of a comparison, for example, with influenza. We go through multiple cycles of influenza. There's always a degree of background immunity in the population. I mean, that will ultimately happen if we get a situation where we get back to normal. Now, I hope we don't have so many people infected that we actually have that herd immunity, but I think it would have to be different than it is right now.
Boy, I hope we don't get to that herd immunity. Well, there is a gigantic, I think, scientific breakthrough this week by a world-renowned brain scientist. In fact, Science Magazine calls him the #1 most influential brain scientist in the world, Carl Friston. He made a discovery this week because he took his knowledge of how to map the brain and decided to map COVID-19. I got to sit down with him in an interview just 2 days ago. For those of you that want to get on with the rest of your day, you can go ahead. But for those of you that actually want to understand the science, really want to understand what's happening in the world today, and are in for some science, get ready to geek out. This is what we do here on the High Wire. I do not hold him down to one soundbite. I want you to listen to what one of the greatest scientists alive today has discovered about COVID-19. This is amazing. It is my honor to be joined right now by Dr. Carl Friston from London. Dr. Friston, Science Magazine rated you and said that you're the #1 most influential brain scientist in the world. What got you into that position? Why are you referred to as that? What's the work that you do?
Largely, I'm famous for brain mapping, human neuroimaging. So this is the approach to understanding how we work by taking images of the human brain, understanding how one part of the brain is connected to or talks to another part of the brain. And as part of that endeavor, you have to drill down onto the fundamentals of how we work as sentient machines, how we interact with other people. And that inquiry, along with hundreds of young students and colleagues, meant that my profile, my footprint in the literature is high, which is why I'm cited a lot.
Now, the work you do is interesting because it involves actually modeling, right? You use sort of computers to input a lot of data when looking at the brain to come to conclusions that we can't just look at the brain and see something in there. We have to sort of take data points coming out. Can you explain that a little bit, how your modeling system works?
Right. So that's exactly the really challenging problem. You know, we want to work out, say, how the engine of a car works, but we can't actually open the bonnet. So we have to infer what's going on under the bonnet on the basis of usually non-invasive signals, hence the neuroimaging. So this is an inference problem. It's really trying to work out what caused those data, the data that we can observe, and then use those data to test hypotheses about the architecture, the functional architecture of the brain in this instance, or the physics of the engine if we're looking at an automobile. And much of the difficulty when trying to infer all the neuronal message passing that is going on inside our heads is it is an immensely complicated and connected system. So one has to test hypotheses about basic architectural principles like hierarchical structures, like concentric organizations, functional specialization for different parts of the brain. But the problem is more general than just understanding the brain. Understanding any dynamical coupled system presents this problem when you only have sparse data, a small number of things you can see that you have to use to infer what you really want to know, which is what you can't actually see.
Obviously, impressive work. You know, you're world renowned in this work of being able to take these data points and, you know, sort of start to map and see a vision of something that would otherwise be invisible. So then how is it that you are now, there's a lot of reporting now about how you've looked at the data of the COVID-19 pandemic and how you're coming to certain conclusions using, my understanding, the modeling you would normally use to map data points coming from the brain or in the brain. Now you're looking at data points around COVID-19. Can you tell me, first of all, why did you decide to take a model that's designed for the brain and have it look at the data around COVID-19?
Right. Well, I suspect like 1,000, if not 100,000 scientists around the world, as soon as lockdown started, we all thought about how can we apply our skills to help. Our skills in this instance were particularly pertinent because the problem that we deal with in the brain mapping and the neurosciences is understanding how populations are connected. Here we're talking about populations of nerve cells in the brain, and the connections are literally white matter connections, wires in your brain. But the underlying dynamics is almost identical to the dynamics that underwrite the connectivity between populations of people that are exposed to a virus. So the way that the virus spreads is very, very similar to the way that the information spreads from one part of the brain to another, or using the analogy of the epidemiology, the way that, say, an infected subpopulation in New York might connect or commute or transmit to, say, California. So the underlying differential equations, the mathematical equations that capture these hypotheses about the epidemiology, the process, the dynamics, are almost identical to the ones that we've been using for a decade or more when trying to infer how a brain connectivity, a network of neuronal populations operates. So we just repurposed validated code and applied it to questions and hypotheses about how populations of people are connected and transmit, in this instance, the virus from one person to another or from one population to another.
It's extremely fascinating and makes a lot of sense, at least, you know, from a lay position of understanding those connections. So in your work, there's a term that's now coming up, and that is non-susceptible. This isn't something that I've heard a lot of discussions about until I started looking at your work. Can you explain what, in terms of COVID-19, what a non-susceptible is?
Right, so this is a really important issue at the moment, and I suspect will become increasingly contentious. So the non-susceptible proportion of a population introduces a heterogeneity into the kinds of people that may be able to become infected by the virus and by implication then transmit that virus to somebody else. And that proportion of the population that is capable of transmitting the virus, of being contagious, that's the key population that you want to, if you like, render innocuous, hopefully via some population or herd immunity. So if everybody in the entire population is capable of giving you the virus, if you want to reach what's called an endemic equilibrium, where you're mitigating or indeed suppressing the outbreak, it means that a large proportion of that entire population has to acquire immunity. On the other hand, if you consider that there is a substantial number of people that simply cannot contract the virus, and if they do contract the virus, a further level of heterogeneity where only a certain proportion of that susceptible proportion can transmit the virus, then we're looking at a very much smaller key subset of spreaders in the population, and it is only they that have to acquire population or herd immunity, which puts a lot of pressure on interpreting the seroprevalence, the number of antibodies that we're recording, or estimates of the number of people that have actually had the virus. Both scenarios, with and without a non-susceptible or a non-contagious subset of the population, speak to very different responses to different kinds of interventions. So, for example, if you believe that everybody is susceptible to the virus and can then communicate it to somebody else, then if you relax or unlock or relax social distancing prematurely, you're inviting then the virus to spread throughout this hitherto unaffected, non-susceptible population. If, on the other hand, you think there is what has been referred to in the media as an immunological dark matter out there, if a substantial number of people just are not in the game, they can't play the game of viral transmission, then you might want to focus much more on enriching the people you're isolating using a track and trace and isolate strategy in the hope of effectively eliminating the carriers and the viruses completely. So it's a big question. At the moment,
so let me just to understand this. What you're referring to is there's again another new term, immunological dark matter and non-susceptible. Those sort of go together, if I'm correct. And the idea that there might be this sort of, you know, just like we say in space, there's dark matter, there, you know, things we can't see, but we know it's there. A non-susceptible body of people, meaning they cannot catch the illness and they certainly can't transmit the illness. For some reason, they are, as you said, not in the game of dealing with this. And so I would imagine, just very quickly, when we look at the imperial model and these gigantic numbers that were coming from Neil Ferguson and his work, you know, 2.2 million potential deaths in America, 500,000 deaths in the UK. Can I assume that that was based on nearly a 100% susceptibility rate, meaning if everybody had to get to reach herd immunity, then certainly even a low death rate? I mean, I still think they were thinking 3%, but whatever, it would be fairly catastrophic, right? If everyone is susceptible to the illness. Is that yep. Can I make that assumption about the imperial model?
You can indeed. That was an excellent summary, right through from the dark matter analogy of stuff out there that we can't see directly. In this instance, we can't actually measure them with PCR tests or antibody tests, but they have a fundamental role in shaping what we can see. And yes, I think you're right. I mean, you'd have to ask Neil directly, but Neil would have been briefed with the worst case scenario, that he had to play it safe. Infections were doubling every 2 to 3 days. They had to make a very quick move and quick decision. And clearly, you're going to opt for the worst case scenario. So what is the worst case scenario? Everybody can be in the game. Everybody is potentially susceptible to infection and also transmission. The alternative hypothesis that there are a substantial, possibly up to say 50%, if not more, of people who are not in the game would predict a much milder outcome. On my reading of the statistics and the modelling at the present time, what has happened so far is that alternative hypothesis is probably more likely at the moment, but only the fullness of time will actually tell. But you're absolutely right. The very big numbers inherit from a worst case assumption that everybody is in danger.
So when you then took the data that we have all over Europe, right? You used mostly European data to input into the way that your model would normally look at the brain and neural pathways and connections. You've made some fairly, bold predictions, or at least how you're reading the data. Can you tell me, in your estimation, this dark matter or this group of non-susceptibles, what is the range you believe we're looking at when we look at the European numbers based on the data, how it's coming out of your model right now?
Right, yeah, so you're absolutely right. We have just completed analysis of the 10 countries globally that have experienced the worst fatality rates. So the current modeling, and I should say, and clearly you will appreciate this, everything I say is conditioned upon the assumptions that are inherent in the model, and they all come equipped with uncertainty. So under the hypothesis that there exists certain kinds of non-susceptibility, and you ask what are the levels of non-susceptibility, i.e. dark matter, that best explain the data, then the answers at the moment are roughly well, let me focus on America. It looks as if about half of the people in America have yet to play the game. So they may be out of the game because they're self-isolating and shielding at home, and they will remain so on their farms or in their apartments until it's safe to come outside again. Some people may be just on islands or sequestered in remote areas. So about half the people are just not actually started to play yet. Of the remaining half, it looks as though about a half simply cannot catch the virus. And if they do, then they have a 50% probability of just developing a mild illness. So, for example, they could have what's called a mucosal immunity, that they fight off the virus at the mucosal level, or they could develop a T-cell immunity that would not necessarily appear in antibody testing. So that leaves just a core subset of a subset of about 20% that are, if you like, they're not super spreaders, but they are spreaders. They're people who are both susceptible. They can develop a fairly serious illness, not necessarily acute respiratory distress, but a symptomatic illness that engenders a B cell or antibody response that is measurable in serological testing. And crucially, if we assume that those people have a sufficient viral load and shedding to infect somebody else, they're the ones that are keeping the epidemic going. So the numbers at the moment, about less than a quarter, a half of a half. So the first half is not susceptible, and the second half is not, you cannot transmit. And then if you contextualize that, given that we're only talking about half of the population of the USA that's actually effectively involved in the pandemic at the moment, then we're talking roughly about the percentages that you're measuring in terms of antibody levels when you look at various studies from, say, New York or California.
Right. So is it safe to say that roughly 80% of the American population is either just not in the game at all or not susceptible, so that we really we should be focusing in your mind on this 20% that can be contagious, can spread the illness? Is 80%, even though half of half, are we close by making that percentage statement?
Yes. Yes, 80% would be possibly optimistic side, but certainly around that level, yes.
Okay.
And I do qualify that because it's just on the model. Those are the numbers that best explain the data so far, but we haven't really seen the offset of the death rates or the new cases in America so far. But yes, I think that would be a ballpark number. How do you deal with that? Certainly, if you could identify those spreaders, those people who become symptomatic and can potentially infect somebody else, that would be wonderful. And of course, that's the agenda behind find, track, trace, isolate, and support. So there's this window of opportunity now, and it may be slightly slower to present itself in America because obviously you have a much larger population. And interestingly, you are dealing with lots of regional outbreaks in each state, and they're all coupled to each other by population fluxes. So the picture in the United States is a slightly richer picture. But overall, I think in the next few weeks and certainly the next month, there's a window of opportunity before what they refer to as a second wave will present itself as a possibility, where testing, tracking, and isolating and supporting may well get on top of the people, get on top of the virus and lead to a plausible mitigation or suppression. And the key people you want to identify are indeed those people who are spreading the virus.
I mean, it's an incredible realization, and I understand that, again, and your model is not, my understanding, the imperial model is a very static model. There's not a whole lot of changing and adjustment, but yours is, you can constantly be updating the work that you're doing as more and more data comes in, which is why, if I'm correct, you're a fan of the contact tracing, the testing. More of that's going to only give you a clearer picture of this dark matter in this group of non-susceptibles, correct?
Yeah, that's a very informed question. So you're absolutely right. The reason I got into this game was to say, hey, look, there is a technology out there that has been tried and tested in the life sciences. Why, would you consider using this in the context of epidemiology? And the big thing it has to offer is exactly what you're talking about. So technically, it's called Bayesian belief updating. It's assimilating information online, on the fly, and then testing different explanations for those data using Bayesian model comparisons. So you're absolutely right. The model which we use is growing by the week, changing subtly in a direction where it's always increasing the evidence in the data for its structure and form. So in fact, the inclusion of this non-susceptible population, the inclusion of this non-contagious population was indeed driven by comparing models with and without these components using, I repeat, Bayesian model comparison, literally comparing the likelihood of these data under this model with this component relative to this other model, a reduced model without that component. And then you can quantify in terms of a log or an odds ratio, how much more likely. So at the moment, in our hands, with our models, all models are wrong, but the models with these non-susceptible subpopulations in are at least 100 times more likely than the ones that are not in. But that will change.
I like the sound of that. I like 100 times more likely to have some qualities we can trust. I think this is really a very hopeful discovery, and the reason being, and you're mentioning a word that I just don't hear enough from at least the health departments around the world and many of those, policymakers, and that's the term herd immunity, right? It seems to me, we can wish and hope on a star that somewhere out in the future there's a vaccine for COVID-19, and there's nothing wrong with wishful thinking, but it doesn't exist on the planet as we know it right now. And I'm concerned about what we hear, the rushing of science. I think those two words together are terrifying as we look at a vaccine. I don't think any science should ever be rushed, especially not when we're talking about an entire population getting a product. I think they should take their time with it. But as we look at this idea of herd immunity, one of the things that I think people would be pushing back is, well, you mean, 70, 80% of us are going to have to catch this illness in order to reach herd immunity? Based on your modeling, that number is really quite a bit, substantially lower. If there's really only a 20% susceptibility group, that would mean to me that most of the nations in the world, whether lockdown or not, still saw infection rates that must have us dangerously close to herd immunity, which I think has two thoughts in my mind. Number one, we should really be promoting healthy people that we know can handle this illness very well, being out there. They don't know if they're in the non-susceptible group based on they might have had the coronavirus last year and it felt like a cold and there's some cross-reactivity. But really, my thought is this. In America, the CDC has essentially come to the determination that 0.4% of those that are symptomatic could die, a death rate of 0.4%. When you add in what they're describing, the CDC says is a 35% asymptomatic carriers not having symptoms, then that really drops your death rate down to 0.26%. When we even take that number, if we took 0.26% across, the 330 million Americans, it's still a large death rate, but it's on par with what we accept with flu and other things. But what you're saying is all we're really maybe accepting is a 0.26% death rate of only potentially 20% of our population. That seems to me to be an argument that we should really begin opening up and doing business, maybe carefully, but certainly opening up so that we can start just letting this virus get to its final end, which is herd immunity. Would you agree with that perspective?
Yeah, yes, that perspective comes along with a lot of angles and numbers, but I think the general thrust sounds sensible. Again, if it is the case that there are a sufficient number of people out there who are not capable of transmitting the virus, then it certainly makes sense that the out here is going to be building up a sufficient degree of immunity in the subpopulation that can actually transmit the virus. And that may well be much lower. So, for example, current estimates from under the models that we're just talking about are about 15% peak seroconversion or antibodies in America. So just to paraphrase what that would mean, if you magically were able to identify all of those people that were not going to suffer a serious illness and subsequent fatality, you might want to certainly encourage them to get out there, because they are resistant. They are going to dilute the number of people who are contagious. A little bit like sort of putting graphite into a nuclear reactor. They will calm things down because they're going to dilute the statistically the propensity of the virus to spread itself around. So they literally provide a shield out there for those susceptible people. And then on the other side of the coin, if you are susceptible and you are subject to these this infection mortality ratio, then you probably just don't want to get into that game. You should probably be still self-isolating and just come out when it's safe. And that could be in 8 months, it could be a year, it could be sooner. If testing and tracking is an efficacious way to actually suppress the virus, then you may well be able to come out. So I think focusing resources on those people who are vulnerable and those people who are potentially contagious and will keep the infection going is probably the right way to deploy resources. I think that if that is your summary, I think that's probably a very fair summary, conditioned upon all the modeling assumptions that we've been talking about.
How far off, I mean, and I appreciate your time, and this is really informative. When we look at the data that's coming in, when we look at the numbers that, I mean, when I hear Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx saying we just don't have the data yet, I struggle to understand how much data is needed when every continent now, as far as I know, in the world has now gone through at least a first wave of this illness. We've had millions of infections. We've seen, hundreds of thousands in the death category, hospitalizations. For someone like you, how much more data is actually needed to begin really effectively making policy? How close are we to having the data that you would feel confident is enough to get the job done, shall we say?
Well, there is a very precise answer to that. About 3 more weeks would tie down whether there is a large proportion of people who are not going to be able to transmit the virus. That will be operationally or strategically important, because it will then, as we've been talking about, put the emphasis on identifying people, on tracking them and tracing them and supporting them. And it'll put much less emphasis on social distancing or the propensity to go back to work or to go shopping. So the sort of technical answer to your question, data is always useful. So the statement "there's never enough data" probably means that for a given level of precision or uncertainty about important parameters of my model, I would need this amount of data. So if you look at it in this sort of graded or quantitative fashion, what that means is that the knowledge or the beliefs or the certainty about the sort of key aspects of your models gently shrink as more data comes in. So the amount of data, as you rightly point out, that would be needed to make some inferences of a certain confidence about what's going to happen in the next few months, I think there's one can make reasonably confident predictions given what has happened in other countries. So you're absolutely right that the shape, which is where all the information is, of the epidemiological curves in countries that have already witnessed the first wave many, many months ago, is incredibly informative about the structure of the model. Clearly, there are going to be country-specific fluctuations or variations in the parameters that would need to be tied down given these countries' data, but the overall shape of it, I think, is fairly well understood. Having said that, There are other big questions, such as what will happen in 6 months or a year's time in relation to a second wave. That will probably require more data. Already there are indications, but these indications are clearly less certain than the technically what's called a posterior prediction about what's going to happen in the next few weeks to next few months. So depending upon the level of the question, there is an enormous amount of data out there. That's something that I've learned from brain responses, the shape of the little flickers of electrical activity that evolve over several hundred milliseconds contains so much information. And in the same way, the shape and the form of the epidemiological waves that extend over weeks contain an enormous amount of information if you believe you know how those shapes and those data were actually caused.
Dr. Friston, I really appreciate your time. Extremely illuminating. I think that, you know, I understand you're very careful, and that is true about scientists, good scientists. You know, I recognize you don't want to jump to a conclusion, but I think we can judge from your use of the word, you know, where there's gentle changes and subtle changes, that you don't think your model is that far off. Can I assume you're not expecting some gigantic spike change that takes us from somewhere in the 75 to 80% non-susceptible rate to, oh my God, I was wrong, it's only 5% are non-susceptible? You're not predicting that level of a change. What you're talking about is maybe some subtle adjustments. And if we're only 3 weeks out, we're certainly going to follow you. I think this is a really, really important discovery. And I would hope that all of the nations of the world, as we are crushing our economies, as we're sending people into poverty, as we're limiting our ability to share resources with each other, even necessary drugs, and all of the complications and dangers to the shutdown that we've been through, it certainly seems that you are shedding light on a path forward towards herd immunity and a focus on where we really need to put our energy on this susceptible group. Have I misstated anything before I wrap this up? Because I just, you know, as we come away from this, I have a really good feeling about the work you're doing, and I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you and answering your questions. Thank you.
Very good. Take care, Dr. Friston. I mean, it's amazing. What an amazing interview. I hope you got as much out of that as I did. We're talking about top world scientists right now. There is no consensus that the lockdown means anything, that masks are necessary. What we're seeing is a consensus of the best scientists in the world recognizing and proving that this is essentially, let me put it in lay terms, a nothing burger. And if you like that clip, then be sure to check out our live broadcast of The High Wire every Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. You can watch it on Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, and Twitter. We'll see you there.